The sentence left the room in pieces. Not loud. Not angry. Just 7 words dropped into a dinner table full of family, guests, and polished wine glasses, and every single one of them landed like a verdict. The army was the only place that ever pretended she mattered. My father said it with a smile. The kind of smile that had always made rooms lean toward him, laugh with him, follow him. And for half a second a few people did laugh. Nervous laughter. Uncomfortable laughter. The kind that fills silence when nobody knows whether to speak up or stay safe. I was already standing. Already reaching for my purse. Already deciding that this time I was simply going to leave. Then a chair moved. Slowly. Deliberately. And the man sitting beside my sister rose to his feet. His name was Ethan Walker. Navy SEAL commander. Decorated. Respected. My sister's fiancé. A man my father had spent the entire evening praising as the gold standard of military achievement. His easy smile was gone. What replaced it was something different. Something controlled and serious and absolutely certain. He looked at my father and said 4 words that nobody in that room was prepared to hear. Sir. I served under her. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was complete. My father's mouth stayed open. The words he'd spent his whole life having ready gone. Simply gone. To understand why that moment meant everything, you first have to understand what it meant to grow up as Richard Turner's daughter. The wrong one. My name is Abigail Turner. I'm 34 years old. I am an officer in the United States Army. I have led soldiers through combat operations. I have coordinated missions involving hundreds of personnel across multiple branches. I have received commendations that most civilians never hear about. None of it ever mattered to my father. I understood that early. When I was 8 years old, my father loaded his truck for a fishing weekend and took my older sister Melissa with him. I stood in the driveway holding a small backpack. Can I come too? He looked at me for maybe 2 seconds. Not this time. Why not? Because Melissa actually likes this stuff. The truck disappeared around the corner. My mother rubbed my shoulder and said maybe next time. There was never a next time. That moment became the blueprint for everything that followed. Melissa wasn't the problem. That matters. People want easy stories where the favored child is cruel, where the villain is obvious. Melissa was none of those things. She was warm and funny and genuinely easy to love. The problem wasn't her. The problem was that my father saw her differently than he saw me, and no achievement I produced ever changed that. When Melissa earned an A, it proved her intelligence. When I earned one, it was expected. When Melissa joined a club, she was ambitious. When I joined one, I was trying too hard. I spent the years of high school telling myself I'd stopped caring what he thought. That was a lie I told often enough to almost believe. The truth was uglier. Part of me never stopped hoping. Every daughter wants her father to look at her with pride, even when she pretends she doesn't. Especially then. At 18 I enlisted. Not as an escape. Not entirely. I enlisted because the Army was the first place in my life that measured me by what I actually did. It didn't care whose daughter I was. It didn't compare me to anyone. It cared whether I showed up, whether I worked, whether I earned my place. And I did. I pushed through exhaustion, injuries, failures, and things I still don't fully talk about. I earned my commission. Promotions followed. Leadership positions, meaningful assignments, the kind of career that speaks for itself. Until I came home. Because every visit back reminded me that inside my father's house, none of it translated. Still playing soldier? He'd ask. You ever going to settle down? There's more to life than work. Meanwhile, Melissa could announce she'd taken up pottery, and he'd react as if she'd invented something. Over the years, I built habits around his patterns. I smiled through the comments. I redirected conversations. I stopped sharing things that mattered. Distance helped. Deployments helped more. Ironically, the farther I was from my childhood home, the more at peace I became. Then Melissa called 6 months before everything changed. I met someone. The excitement in her voice was immediate and real. His name is Ethan. He's serious. They got engaged a few months later. When she mentioned he was a Navy SEAL commander, I thought it was interesting. Nothing more. The military world is small, but not that small. I believed that right up until it wasn't true anymore. My latest deployment had lasted 9 months. When I came back stateside, I was the kind of tired that settles into your bones and doesn't leave quickly. A week after I returned, my mother called. She used the careful tone she always kept for family events. Your father and I are hosting dinner. I already knew what was coming. Melissa and Ethan? Yes. I exhaled. When? Saturday. A pause. Then softly. I'd really like you to come. Not your father. Not your sister. My mother. So I said yes. Saturday arrived gray and cold. I drove through the neighborhood where I grew up and let the memories come without fighting them. The elementary school. The grocery store where Dad used to buy Melissa ice cream after soccer games. The church parking lot where he forgot to pick me up after debate practice. Funny what holds on. I sat in front of the house for a moment before going in. Same white siding. Same porch swing. Same maple tree. Everything unchanged. But I wasn't the girl who had left. I hadn't needed my father's approval in years. At least that's what I kept reminding myself. My mother greeted me first. The hug was tight and genuine. Melissa appeared seconds after, arms already open. You look amazing. That's a lie. That's sisterly love. We laughed, and for a few minutes the evening felt almost normal. Then I heard my father's voice from across the room. He was talking to Ethan's parents with that particular energy he reserved for moments when he was proud. I watched him raise his glass. Melissa has always been the child who made me proud. The conversation around him rolled on as if nothing had been said. Nobody reacted. Nobody noticed. Except me. Because after 34 years, I knew exactly what those words included and exactly who they left out. I wish I could tell you it no longer hurt. That years of deployments and promotions and building an entire life away from that house had made me immune. But pain doesn't follow a career arc. Certain wounds don't heal completely. They simply learn to stay quiet. And my father's voice had always known exactly where mine were buried. I stood near the kitchen island pretending to examine a bowl of mixed nuts while conversations circled around me. I struck up a conversation with Ethan's mother, Karen Walker. She was sharp, warm, genuinely curious. So you're stationed in Virginia? Melissa says you travel constantly. I told her it came with the territory. She said she imagined I'd seen things most people couldn't picture. Before I could respond, my father materialized beside us with a drink in hand. Oh, don't let Abigail fool you. My stomach dropped. Here it was. She'll make it sound more dramatic than it is. Karen looked uncomfortable. I offered the smile I perfected over decades. It's okay. I'm used to him. Dad laughed loudly. See, sense of humor. That's important when your daughter spends her life playing G.I. Jane. A few people nearby chuckled. Across the room, I noticed Ethan glance toward us. He wasn't laughing. He was watching. Dinner was served 30 minutes later. The dining room looked the way my mother always made things look when she'd spent days preparing. Candles. The good china. Crystal vases with fresh flowers. It should have felt celebratory. Instead, it felt like waiting for weather to turn. I ended up near the far end of the table. Melissa sat beside Ethan. My father claimed the head like someone who had never questioned his right to it. The first 20 minutes passed safely. Travel, wedding plans, family traditions, restaurants. All the topics people reach for when they want conversation without risk. Then Ethan's father asked me a simple question. So Abigail, how long have you been in the Army? 12 years as an officer, I told him. His eyebrows lifted. That's impressive. Before I could continue, my father cut in. She started because she was too stubborn to do anything else. Scattered nervous laughter. I stared at my plate. Ethan's father looked between us slowly, like someone beginning to recognize a pattern. I tried to keep things moving. Actually, I found leadership rewarding from the beginning. Dad snorted. Of course you did. I looked up. What does that mean? He shrugged. You always like telling people what to do. Across the table, Melissa closed her eyes briefly. I recognized that look. She was embarrassed. But she said nothing. Nobody did. Because that's how family patterns survive for decades. Not because everyone agrees, but because everyone quietly decides which fights aren't worth having. The problem is that silence eventually becomes its own form of permission. The conversation limped forward. Wedding planning came back around. Ethan's mother asked where they planned to live. Dad immediately lit up. You two are going to have a wonderful life. The pride in his voice was genuine and effortless and completely familiar. Stability. A respected military career. He pointed to Ethan, then to Melissa. And you've always had good instincts. I felt the familiar ache behind my ribs. Not jealousy exactly. Something sadder. The quiet realization that no matter how much I'd accomplished, a small part of me still noticed the difference. Still measured it. Still hoped. More wine was poured as the evening wore on. The room grew louder, looser. My father grew more comfortable, which was always dangerous. Richard Turner with 2 glasses of wine was blunt. Richard Turner with 4 was reckless. By dessert we had reached reckless. Someone asked Ethan about SEAL training. The table leaned in. Questions came from every direction: the physical demands, the mental pressure, the selection process. Ethan answered each one with quiet honesty. No exaggeration, no performance. That restraint only made people respect him more. My father practically glowed. This guy is the real deal. He slapped Ethan on the shoulder. Now this is what military service looks like. The laughter that followed didn't need to include a comparison. The comparison was already hanging in the air. Dad refilled his glass. When Melissa told me she was dating a SEAL commander, I nearly fell out of my chair. More laughter. My mother stared at her coffee. Melissa shifted in her seat. I recognized the signs. She wanted him to stop. She wouldn't say so yet. Then my father looked directly at me. I knew what was coming before he opened his mouth. Children of difficult parents develop that ability. They learn to feel the impact before it arrives. Don't get me wrong, he said. I'm proud of both my girls. It almost sounded like something a father should say. Then came the rest. But Ethan represents the kind of military achievement people actually respect. The room stilled. Even Dad seemed briefly surprised by his own words. Then he pressed forward because stopping would have meant admitting he'd gone too far. And Richard Turner didn't admit things like that. Abigail spent years chasing ranks and titles. He gestured toward me casually. Ethan became one of the toughest operators on the planet. Karen Walker looked horrified. My mother whispered his name. Richard. He waved her off. Come on. We're all family here. Those 5 words. I've learned they almost always arrive right before something unforgivable. He leaned back in his chair, comfortable, performing, playing to a room that had stopped wanting to play along. Then he delivered it. The army was the only place that ever pretended she mattered. Half a second of silence. Then a few uncomfortable sounds that weren't quite laughter. Someone looked away. Someone studied their drink. Someone reached for their phone. Heat flooded my face. Not rage, humiliation. The particular kind that makes your skin feel like it belongs to someone else. My chair scraped back. I stood. Nobody stopped me. People rarely do when humiliation happens in real time. They protect themselves. They stay quiet and hope it moves on. Picked up my purse. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I think I'm going to head home. My mother's face collapsed. Melissa whispered my name. But I couldn't stay. Not after that. Not this time. I turned toward the hallway. Then I heard a chair move. Slowly. Deliberately. I turned back. Ethan Walker was on his feet. Everything about him had changed. The easy dinner guest, the gracious future son-in-law, the man who'd spent the evening being charming and modest, gone. What stood in his place was the face of a military commander. Calm. Focused. Utterly certain. The room recognized it immediately. Conversations dropped. Even my father stopped smiling. Ethan stepped away from the table and faced him directly. Sir. His voice was even unhurried. It didn't need volume. Every person in that room heard every word. My father chuckled, uneasy now. What? Ethan held his gaze without flinching. That's not true. Dad blinked. What isn't? The pause lasted just long enough to make the room hold its breath. Sir. Ethan glanced briefly at me, then back at my father. I served under Abigail Turner. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd felt in that house before. It wasn't the silence of an awkward pause or a conversation briefly interrupted. It was the silence of something real landing in a room that wasn't expecting it. Something heavy and true and impossible to dismiss. My father stared. A short laugh escaped him. Forced, thin, the kind people produce when reality doesn't match the story they've spent years telling themselves. Come on. What are you talking about? Ethan didn't smile. He didn't sit back down. Every person at that table who understood military bearing recognized what they were seeing. He looked less like a man at a family dinner and more like a commander at a briefing. I served under Abigail. Dad shook his head. No, you're a Navy SEAL. Yes, sir. And she's Army. Yes, sir. My father spread his hands. As far as I know, that's not how it works. Can be, Ethan said simply. I stood near the hallway, still holding my purse, unable to decide whether to go or stay. Part of me wanted to disappear. Another part couldn't move because for the first time in my life, someone else was standing in that room and telling the truth about me. Not out of loyalty, not out of love, but because they had lived it. Ethan glanced at me briefly. Something in his expression softened for just a moment. Then he turned back to my father and began. About 8 years ago, I was assigned to a joint special operations task force. A few people exchanged quiet looks. We had personnel from multiple branches. My father sat with his arms folded, jaw set. The officer coordinating our operational planning was then Major Abigail Turner. Several heads turned toward me. I looked away from them. Years of experience had taught me that drawing attention to my own record inside this house usually made things worse. Ethan continued. She wasn't just part of the operation. He paused. She was leading it. The room absorbed that. Melissa looked between Ethan and me the way someone looks when they realize the map they've been reading is wrong. She knew I'd been successful. I understood that. But there is a difference between knowing someone has a career and hearing a man like Ethan Walker describe that person as his commanding officer. Those aren't the same knowledge. They don't land the same way. Dad laughed again, thinner this time. Well, leadership positions don't always mean much. The statement drifted over the table like smoke. Even he seemed to hear how hollow it sounded. Ethan's expression shifted, not to anger, but to something almost like genuine confusion, as if he truly couldn't understand why someone would say that. With respect, sir, in that environment leadership means everything. Nobody interrupted. Not even my father. The mission involved multiple teams operating across a volatile region. Ethan chose his words carefully. Some details he couldn't share and he didn't try. He didn't need specifics. The point wasn't classified information. The point was who Abigail Turner was. Things went wrong. My chest tightened. I knew exactly which operation he meant. After all this time, certain memories don't fade. They just wait. The dust, the generators running constantly, the radio traffic stacking up, the exhaustion that became its own kind of background noise, and underneath all of it, the weight of being responsible for every person in your care. We received intelligence that turned out to be inaccurate. The room was completely still. No dishes, no movement, no background sounds. Our team entered an area that was supposed to be secure. His jaw tightened slightly. It wasn't. Not a single person spoke. Ethan continued. Communications became unreliable. We had wounded personnel. He looked directly at my father. We thought we weren't getting out. My mother pressed both hands over her mouth. Melissa stared at Ethan. My father's expression had shifted into something I rarely saw on him, uncertainty. Not belief, not yet, but uncertainty. For a man who had spent his life being certain about everything, especially his daughters, that was something. The safest option would have been to pull back. I knew where this was going. I also knew, somewhere quiet inside myself, that I had never wanted it told this way. Not in a dining room. Not as a story to correct someone's father. These memories aren't trophies. They're not dinner party material. They belong to the people who lived them. They live as scars, not awards. Ethan glanced toward me again. Something close to an apology in his eyes. Then he kept going. Major Turner refused. The room silenced itself a second time. She personally coordinated the extraction. My father shifted slightly in his chair. When conditions deteriorated further, she moved closer to the operational area herself. Karen Walker looked stunned. What does that mean? Ethan didn't hesitate. It means she accepted risks that most senior officers would have passed to someone else. I looked away. The room felt too small, too warm, too close. Because Ethan wasn't building a story. He wasn't performing. He was simply saying things that were true, things I had never said about myself to anyone in this house. Things I had deliberately kept silent, not from strangers but from family. From him. I was 26 years old, Ethan said. A faint smile crossed his face. convinced I knew everything. A few quiet laughs around the table. The tension eased for just a breath before settling back in. I remember hearing her voice on the radio. His eyes found mine, and this time I couldn't look away. You don't forget certain moments. He paused. I remember realizing somebody wasn't leaving us behind. Something tightened in my throat. That mattered. Nobody moved. Nobody dared. Then Ethan said the sentence that changed the temperature of the entire room. If Major Turner hadn't made the decision she made that day, I wouldn't be sitting in this room. My father's face shifted. The color drained from it. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way a man looks when something beneath his feet begins to give way. Melissa sat with tears forming in her eyes. Not because of the mission, but because something larger was coming into focus for her. How much of my life she had never seen. How much she had never known to look for. Dad found his voice. Well, he cleared his throat. People tend to remember things bigger than they were. I closed my eyes for a moment. There it was. The reflex. The need to reduce, to explain away, to keep his version of reality intact. For years I had been the only one who ever heard it. Now everyone in that room heard it. Everyone could see what it was. Ethan's expression hardened. Not with anger, with something quieter and more damning. Disappointment. The kind reserved for someone who refuses to face the obvious truth in front of them. Sir, he said steadily, I'm not exaggerating. My father opened his mouth. Another explanation was forming. Another exit from accountability. And then a different voice filled the room. Older. Measured. Completely calm. Ethan's father, Robert Walker, set down his wine glass with a quiet click and looked directly at Richard Turner. No. The room turned. No, Richard. He held his gaze without blinking. My son isn't exaggerating at all. The silence that came after Robert Walker's words was different from all the ones before it. Earlier silences had been shock. This one was something slower recognition. The uncomfortable, unavoidable arrival of truth into a room that had been comfortably holding it at arm's length for a long time. Richard Turner sat at the head of his table without moving. For perhaps the first time in his life, the room wasn't following him. The laughter wasn't coming. Nobody was looking to him to set the tone. The audience had simply stopped playing their part. And he could feel it. Robert Walker was retired Navy. But there was nothing retired about the way he carried himself. The quiet confidence. The precision. The habit of saying only what needed to be said and nothing beyond it. He looked toward me first briefly, then back at my father. I recognized her name the moment Ethan told us who Melissa's sister was. I wanted him to stop. I understood what was coming, and I had spent years arranging my life to prevent exactly this. Not because I was ashamed, but because I had stopped wanting acknowledgement from people who had to be told to give it. Robert continued anyway. There aren't many officers whose reputations travel that far. The room went still again. My father frowned. What exactly is that supposed to mean? Robert folded his hands on the table. Means people know who she is. Dad scoffed. In army circles, maybe. Robert didn't react. Didn't raise his voice. Just corrected him. In military circles. 2 words. No elaboration needed. They landed harder than any argument. Across the table my mother was crying. Not loudly, the quiet kind. The kind that appears when someone understands they've missed something they should have seen a long time ago. Melissa looked equally undone. I couldn't fault her. My family knew almost nothing about my career, and that had been my choice. A deliberate one. Early on I'd learned that sharing achievements inside this house led to one of 2 outcomes. My father would dismiss them outright, or he'd find a way to make them irrelevant. So I stopped. It was less painful that way. It was survival. Robert looked at me carefully. You're still uncomfortable with attention. I smiled slightly. Occupational hazard. He shook his head. No. I don't think that's the reason. Nobody argued with him. Nobody needed to. My father shifted. The certainty he'd carried all evening had begun to crack. Not collapse, just fracture visibly, the way ice does before it gives. He looked at me. And for the first time that night, the confidence was replaced by something that might have been genuine. Why didn't you ever tell us any of this? The question almost made me laugh, not from cruelty, but because it showed how completely he'd missed the point. I set my purse down on a nearby chair. For the first time all evening, I stopped trying to leave. Maybe because I realized the conversation I had avoided for years was already happening, whether I stayed or not. There was no point running from something already in the room. I looked at him steadily. Tell you what? His expression tightened. All of this. I held his gaze. The awards. Nothing. The leadership positions. Still nothing. The deployments. A muscle moved in his jaw. I nodded slowly. Okay. The room was impossibly still. Then I asked the question that had lived inside me for longer than I could measure. Would you have listened? His face changed immediately. Not to anger. To recognition. Because he knew the answer. And so did everyone else in that room. Nobody spoke. And the silence was its own kind of answer. Memories surfaced without permission, the way they do when something long locked away finally opens. I remembered the day I graduated from officer candidate school. The auditorium packed with families, pride filling every row, photographs and cheers and people pressed together. My mother had come. My father hadn't. He told me later he'd been helping Melissa move apartments. I remembered my first major commendation. I mailed a copy of the citation home. Weeks passed. I eventually asked if he'd received it. Yeah. That was everything he said. Just yeah. I remembered standing in a military hangar before a deployment, calling home one last time, listening to the phone ring until it didn't anymore. He never called back. None of those moments had been catastrophic on their own. Together they had built something much heavier. A lifetime of small absences that accumulated into something that felt like a verdict. Melissa pressed her hand over her mouth. Oh my God. She wasn't speaking to anyone at the table. She was speaking to herself, to the thing unraveling inside her. She turned to me. You never told me. I smiled, the sad kind. Her face crumpled immediately. She understood. When would I have told her? During family dinners where the subject changed before I could finish a sentence? During holidays where nobody thought to ask? During birthdays where conversations orbited everyone else? She lowered her head. And for the first time in a long time I felt something unexpected. I felt sorry for her too. Being the favored child carries its own kind of blindness. Not a malicious blindness. A comfortable one. The kind that lets you live inside a version of your family without ever seeing what someone else is carrying right beside you. My mother finally spoke. Her voice was barely steady. Abigail. I looked at her. Tears had moved past the quiet stage now. I should have done more. Those words hit harder than anything else spoken that night. Because she wasn't defending herself. She was simply telling the truth. I walked to her and held her hand. You did what you could. She shook her head slowly. No. Then she turned toward my father, and what happened next was something I had never once seen in 40 years of watching their marriage. My mother faced him directly. You treated her like she didn't matter. The room didn't just freeze, it held its breath. My father looked genuinely stunned. Not by the accusation, by who was making it. Linda. Her voice sharpened in a way I had never heard. You don't get to interrupt me. Even Ethan looked surprised. She continued. Every achievement. Every milestone. Every accomplishment. Her voice shook with something between grief and resolve. You always found a reason to dismiss it. That's not true, my father said. Nobody agreed with him. Not one person. The room's silence said everything that words couldn't. Melissa spoke next. Quietly. Like someone confessing. I should have said something years ago. My father looked at her. Then at me, then around the room, scanning for someone to shift the weight onto. There was no one. The performance was over. The room had decided. Only the truth was left. For the first time all evening he looked old. Not elderly, tired. Like someone who had just discovered that the weight he'd been setting down on others for decades had been gathering somewhere. And now it was all his to carry. His eyes came to rest on me. The room stayed completely still. No interruptions. No rescues. Just a father and a daughter and 34 years of distance sitting between them. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Tried again. Nothing came out. Because Richard Turner had finally run out of things to say. The strangest thing about moments you've imagined for years is how differently they arrive. I had pictured this conversation more times than I could count. Usually during long flights or sleepless hotel nights. Or the quiet aftermath of difficult days. I had rehearsed it. I knew what I'd say, how I'd make him understand, what it would feel like to finally be heard. But standing in my parents' dining room, looking at the man who had shaped so much of what I believed about myself, I didn't feel any of that. I wasn't angry. I was tired. And maybe that was the larger grief. Because anger still requires hope. Anger means part of you believes something can still be changed. What I felt was something quieter. Acceptance. Not peace, not yet, but the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying something heavy for long enough that you stop feeling its weight. The room watched my father. He swallowed. Everything that had made him the center of every room he entered was gone. The wit, the confidence, the performance of a man who had always known how to command an audience. What sat at that table now was simply a father looking at what his choices had cost. I didn't know. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I nodded. I know. He seemed surprised. Maybe he expected anger. An accusation. Something sharp and deserved. Instead, I simply acknowledged what was true because I believed it. He didn't know. Not because the information was hidden, but because he had never cared enough to look. Those are different things. And the difference matters. He stared at the table for a long moment, then raised his eyes to mine. I'm sorry. The words rested there in the room. My mother closed her eyes. Melissa wiped her face. Ethan was perfectly still. Nobody moved to smooth it over. Nobody rushed to say everything was fine because everyone understood something important. An apology is not a time machine. It cannot give back missed graduations or unanswered calls or years of silence. It cannot undo what was built in its absence. He continued. I should have been better. I know that now. I believed him. That was the unexpected part. After everything, I believed him. But believing him didn't restore anything. It simply meant the truth had finally arrived. Just decades late. He looked up at me. What can I do? The question came from somewhere real. Not from pride, not from performance, from regret. Genuine regret. I thought about it in the silence that followed. And the answer that came surprised me because it wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. The suffering was already there. He was living it right now, quietly, in front of everyone he'd wanted to impress. I took a breath. Do you know what I wanted all those years? He shook his head. I didn't need praise. The room was silent. I didn't need awards or recognition or for you to tell everyone I was exceptional. My voice stayed even. What I needed was a father. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. My father looked as though something inside him had broken. Not dramatically, not with noise, just enough. Enough to see. Enough to finally understand what all those years had cost both of us. Tears came to his eyes. He looked away briefly, then bowed his head. And the room let him sit there in it, because nothing else needed to be said. A few moments later, Ethan came to stand beside me. The weight in the room shifted slightly. He offered a small smile. I'm sorry. For what? For telling that story. I shook my head. No. I looked at him carefully. Thank you. His expression softened. You saved people. I smiled. We all did. He nodded, and I think we both understood something that only certain people understand, the kind who've spent time in places where the difference between going home and not going home comes down to decisions made in seconds. No one succeeds alone. Every achievement belongs to the people beside you. Every leader stands on what others quietly gave. Melissa came next. She wrapped her arms around me the way she used to when we were small, before the world had taught either of us what it meant to be compared. I'm sorry. Her voice broke a little. I held her. I know. She pulled back, her face streaked with tears. I should have seen it. Maybe she should have. Maybe she couldn't. I had stopped calculating blame a long time ago. Life had already spent enough of all of us. My mother joined us, and the four of us stood together in the center of the dining room. A family with fractures, yes. But for the first time in as long as I could remember, we were being honest about them. Not healed. Not whole. Honest. And in that moment, honest was enough. The evening ended quietly. No dramatic confrontations, no final speeches, just people gradually gathering themselves back together. Collecting coats, clearing dishes, speaking in lower voices, each of them processing something they hadn't walked in expecting to face. When I finally left, my father walked me to the front porch. The night was cool and clear. The neighborhood was still. Stars crowded the sky above the same tree I had climbed as a child. Before I understood that some heights you reach at home matter more than any you'll ever reach anywhere else. We stood without speaking for a little while. Then he said something I had spent most of my life not letting myself want. "I'm proud of you." I looked at him. Really looked. And I discovered something I hadn't expected. I wasn't waiting for those words anymore. The girl who had needed them had grown into someone else, somewhere along the long road between that driveway and this porch. She had built her worth in places and ways that had nothing to do with his recognition. But still, hearing them mattered. Not because they completed me, because they completed something else. A chapter. An old wound. A story that had been waiting too long for its ending. I smiled. "Thank you, Dad." Nothing more needed to be said. 3 months later, Melissa and Ethan were married near the Chesapeake Bay. The ceremony was simple and beautiful and exactly right. Military colleagues came from across the country, retired generals, senior officers, soldiers I had stood beside in places we never talked about at dinner parties. One by one, they found me throughout the evening. Handshakes, stories, laughter that carried the specific warmth of people who have been through things together. I noticed my father watching from across the reception hall. Not interrupting. Not filling the space with his voice. Just watching. Learning perhaps who his daughter had always been. Later in the evening our eyes met across the room. He raised his glass. A quiet gesture. Small, unhurried, sincere. And I understood something clearly, maybe for the first time. My father had spent more than 30 years unable to see my worth. But my worth had never lived inside his ability to see it. Not then. Not on any of those difficult nights. Not now. It had always existed independent of his recognition, the way the sun doesn't require an audience to rise. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do after years of being overlooked isn't to demand acknowledgement. It's to live a life so genuine, so full, so rooted in who you actually are, that eventually the truth simply cannot be ignored. And when it finally speaks for itself, you realize you no longer needed it to.